Granton was a city divided. It wore the guise of a modern metropolis, with glass skyscrapers piercing the sky and bustling avenues filled with commerce. But beneath the glittering surface, beneath the facade of prosperity, lurked a deep-rooted darkness, an undercurrent of injustice, inequality, and a system carefully designed to favor the privileged while suppressing the marginalized. At the helm of this system was Mayor Richard Calloway, a man born into privilege. He had never known struggle. His father had been a senator, his grandfather a railroad tycoon, and he had inherited both wealth and entitlement in equal measure. He ruled Granton with an iron fist, cloaked in civility, but those who knew him well understood his disdain for those he considered beneath him, and by beneath him, he meant anyone who did not fit into his narrow vision of power, particularly the black and minority communities who had long fought for their rightful place in the city. Richard Calloway had been re-elected twice, not because he was beloved by the people but because he had perfected the art of playing politics. His influence stretched through the police department, the city council, and even the local media, ensuring that his name was synonymous with authority. He had turned law enforcement into a personal weapon, using it to silence protests, dismantle grassroots organizations, and criminalize those who dared to demand justice. Angela Carter had seen this firsthand. She had been working in Granton for years, advocating for disenfranchised communities, fighting for policies that would create opportunities for the people Calloway sought to suppress. She was intelligent, articulate, and unafraid to speak truth to power. But she was also careful. She knew how dangerous it was to challenge a man like Calloway, how easily he could ruin lives. And yet, on that fateful afternoon, she had no idea that she was about to become his next target. It was a warm autumn afternoon when Angela stepped into Winston and Harper, a high-end boutique in the heart of Granton's commercial district. She wasn't there to make a political statement, nor to fight any battles. She was simply shopping for a gift, a thoughtful gesture for her husband, Marcus Carter, who had just returned from a grueling international summit. She moved through the store with the quiet grace she had always carried, her fingers brushing against the silk ties and leather-bound journals arranged on polished mahogany shelves. The store was nearly empty, save for an elderly woman browsing handbags and a sharply dressed man examining a set of cufflinks. Angela was aware of the eyes on her the moment she stepped in. The sales associate, a young blonde woman in a navy blue blazer, stiffened at her presence. The security guard near the entrance straightened his posture, his gaze narrowing ever so slightly. She had seen this before. It was the way their eyes lingered on her hands when she picked up an item, the way their movements became more alert, their attention more scrutinizing. She had experienced it in department stores, restaurants, even hotel lobbies, the silent suspicion, the assumption that she did not belong. But today, she had no patience for it. "Excuse me," she said, turning toward the saleswoman. "I'd like to see this watch in the display case." The woman hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's a limited edition piece," she said. "It's quite expensive." Angela arched an eyebrow. "I understand that." A beat of silence. Then, reluctantly, the saleswoman retrieved the watch from the case, her fingers twitching slightly as she handed it over. Angela barely had time to examine it before the door of the boutique swung open. Heavy footsteps, commanding presence. The air in the room shifted. Mayor Richard Calloway had arrived. He was flanked by 2 police officers, his expression one of smug self-importance as he surveyed the store. He wasn't here to shop. He was here for something else, perhaps a meeting with the store owner, or just another opportunity to bask in the adoration of Granton's elite. And then, his eyes landed on Angela. His expression darkened. For a moment, she thought he didn't recognize her. That would be expected, after all. She was just one of many advocates he had dismissed over the years. But then his gaze sharpened, his mouth curling into something that wasn't quite a smirk, wasn't quite a sneer. "What do we have here?" he mused, his voice carrying across the boutique. Angela didn't respond. She wasn't in the mood for a confrontation. The saleswoman shifted uncomfortably. The security guard took a step forward. "Is there a problem, Mr. Mayor?" The store manager, a middle-aged man in a charcoal suit, asked hesitantly. Calloway's eyes didn't leave Angela. "I don't know yet," he said. Angela set the watch down. "If you'll excuse me, I was just leaving." But as she turned, one of the officers blocked her path. "That won't be necessary," Calloway said. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Angela stiffened. "About what?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it clear that this was personal. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said. "And you fit the description." Her hands clenched into fists. "The description? You know how it is," Calloway said, feigning nonchalance. "Some people come in here pretending to shop when they have other intentions." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Angela breathed in deeply, forcing herself to stay calm. She knew what he was doing. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to snap, to raise her voice, to lash out so that he could turn her into the villain. She would not give him that satisfaction. "I have nothing to discuss with you," she said evenly. "If you want to accuse me of something, do it properly. Otherwise, I suggest you move." Calloway's smirk deepened. He took another step forward, invading her space, and then, with a swift movement, he reached out, grabbing her wrist. Angela gasped. The store manager flinched. The saleswoman let out a small, startled cry. The grip was firm, too firm. "You don't walk away from me," Calloway hissed. And then he pushed her, not hard enough to throw her across the room, but hard enough to make her stumble, hard enough to send a message. Angela barely caught herself before hitting the floor. A sharp pain flared in her wrist. She heard a gasp from one of the customers, the horrified murmurs of onlookers, and then the unmistakable sound of a phone recording. Someone was filming. Calloway saw it too. For the first time, his confidence flickered, just for a moment, just long enough for Angela to see it. He had made a mistake, and he had no idea just how much he was about to regret it. Angela sat in the passenger seat of her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. The boutique's bright lights still flickered in the rearview mirror, a reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. Her wrist throbbed where Calloway had grabbed her, and though she had walked out with her head held high, the weight of the incident pressed heavily on her chest. She wasn't sure how long she sat there before she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating. She could call Marcus, tell him everything, but she knew what that would mean. She knew her husband. Marcus Carter was not just any man. He was the United States Attorney General, a man who had spent his career tearing apart corruption and injustice, a man who had made it his mission to dismantle systemic racism from within the very halls of power that had upheld it for so long. But tonight, it wouldn't be the Attorney General who answered the phone. It would be her husband, and he would be furious. With a deep breath, she pressed the call button. The line barely rang once before his voice came through. "Angela?" She closed her eyes. "Marcus." Even through the phone, she could hear the tension in his silence. "What happened?" Angela tried to steady herself. "I was at Winston and Harper. She hesitated. "I had an encounter with Richard Calloway." The air between them shifted. "An encounter?" Marcus's voice darkened. "What kind of encounter?" Angela knew there was no way to soften it. "He accused me of shoplifting, in front of everyone. Then he grabbed me and shoved me." There was no immediate response, just the sound of Marcus breathing, deep and slow, the way he did when he was trying to control the fire in his chest. "Where are you now?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "In my car. I'm coming to get you." She sat up. "Marcus." "No," I said. "I'm coming to get you." The call ended. Angela exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temples. She knew what was coming. Less than 20 minutes later, Headlights washed over her car, and a sleek black sedan pulled up beside her. Before she could even open the door, Marcus was already there, his tall frame moving with controlled urgency. His eyes swept over her, searching for signs of injury. When he saw the faint bruise forming on her wrist, something inside him snapped. "Angela," he murmured, his jaw tight. "I'm okay," she assured him, but the look in his eyes said he didn't believe her. "Get in my car," he said. She hesitated. "Marcus, we need to think." "I'm thinking," he said, his voice low and firm. "And the only thought in my head right now is how Calloway is about to regret every second of what he just did." Angela swallowed. She had seen Marcus angry before, but this was different. This wasn't anger. This was war. The ride home was silent. Angela could feel the energy radiating off Marcus as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. She knew better than to speak right now. He was calculating, deciding on the best course of action. And she also knew that no matter what she said, there was no stopping him. When they pulled into the driveway of their brownstone, Marcus shut off the engine but didn't move. He sat there, staring ahead, his breath steady but deep. Angela finally broke the silence. "Marcus, I need you to be careful." His eyes flicked to her, sharp and unreadable. "Careful." He let out a low, humorless laugh. "Angela, that man put his hands on you. He humiliated you in public. And the only reason he thought he could do it is because he believes there won't be consequences." "There will be consequences," she said. "But we need to do this the right way." Marcus turned fully toward her. "Do you think he's worried about doing things the right way?" His voice was still controlled, but there was an edge to it, a quiet fury simmering just beneath the surface. Angela reached for his hand, squeezing it. "You are the Attorney General of the United States. You can destroy him without ever raising your voice." His fingers tightened around hers. "You're right," he said finally. "But I'm not just the Attorney General. I'm your husband, and tonight, that's the only title I care about." Angela sighed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she got out of the car, and Marcus followed her into the house. As soon as they stepped inside, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "David," he said the moment the line connected, "I need you to pull everything you can find on Richard Calloway. Every dirty deal, every complaint, every lawsuit he's ever buried. I want to know who funds him, who protects him, and who will flip on him the fastest." Angela watched as Marcus's expression darkened with each passing second. "Send me the files within the hour," he continued, "because by morning, Richard Calloway is going to wish he had never set foot in that store." He ended the call and exhaled slowly. "It's starting," he muttered. Angela stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "We knew this would happen eventually." Marcus met her gaze. "Yeah," he said, "but I wanted it to happen my way. Not because he laid his hands on my wife." Angela's eyes softened. "It doesn't matter how it started," she said. "What matters is how we finish it." Marcus let out a breath and nodded. "Then let's finish it." Angela smiled, but in her heart, she knew that things were about to escalate beyond anything they had ever faced before, because Richard Calloway didn't know it yet. But his empire was about to crumble. And by the time Marcus was done with him, there would be nothing left but ashes. Morning arrived with the weight of a storm hanging in the air. The video of Richard Calloway's attack on Angela had gone viral overnight. Social media was ablaze with fury, with hashtags calling for his resignation, for justice, for accountability. News anchors dissected the footage. Analysts debated whether this was finally the moment Calloway would fall, and civil rights leaders called for action. Marcus was up before dawn. He sat in his study, the glow of his laptop illuminating the hard lines of his face. A steaming cup of untouched coffee rested beside him as he sifted through the documents David had sent him overnight. The files were a goldmine. Years of corruption, embezzlement, a real estate scandal where Calloway had seized properties in Black and Latino neighborhoods under the guise of urban renewal. then sold them to his allies for pennies on the dollar. A police department operating as his personal security force, covering up excessive force complaints, burying misconduct reports. And then there were the secret donations, millions funneled into his campaign from organizations with disturbing ties to extremist groups. Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. This wasn't just a scandal. This was a reckoning. Angela entered the study, dressed in a simple cream-colored blouse and slacks, her presence grounding him. She had barely slept, but the fire in her eyes was unwavering. "Tell me what you found," she said. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We have everything we need to take him down. If this were any other corrupt politician, he'd be finished by lunchtime." He exhaled sharply. "But this isn't any other politician. This is Calloway. He's built an empire of protection around himself. His allies in the city council, the judges he's helped get elected, the donors backing him. He won't go quietly." Angela nodded, as if she had already expected this. "Then we make him loud." Marcus arched an eyebrow. She stepped forward, placing her hands on his desk. "We don't just expose him. We make it impossible for anyone to defend him. We dismantle every excuse they could possibly use to shield him. We control the story before they do." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We start with the press." Angela picked up her phone and started dialing. By noon, the first domino had fallen. The steps of City Hall were swarmed with reporters. Cameramen jostled for position. Microphones were hastily set up, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The press had been promised something explosive, and the presence of the United States Attorney General confirmed that they would not be disappointed. Marcus stepped up to the podium, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Angela stood beside him, her wrist still faintly bruised but her head held high. "Good afternoon," Marcus began, his voice steady. "As many of you are aware, a video surfaced yesterday depicting an incident between Mayor Richard Calloway and my wife, Angela Carter. The footage speaks for itself. But what you may not know is that this incident is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a much larger disease that has plagued this city for years." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Marcus continued, "My office has been investigating corruption in Granton for months, and today, we are making our findings public." The reporters straightened, pens poised over notepads. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder, placing it on the podium. "These are documents detailing the unlawful seizure of properties from Black and Latino families under Mayor Calloway's administration. These are financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal contributions to his campaign. And these," he lifted another stack of papers, "are internal police reports that prove, beyond any doubt, that Calloway has protected officers involved in cases of racial violence." The crowd erupted. Shutters clicked. Questions were shouted. But Marcus wasn't done. "Effective immediately, my office is launching a formal investigation into Richard Calloway. This will be a full-scale federal inquiry. We will pursue every lead, expose every lie, and hold every person involved accountable." He let the words hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. "No one is above the law, not even the mayor of Granton." A frenzy of questions exploded around him, but Marcus had already turned to leave. Angela followed, feeling the shift in the air. The storm had arrived, and Calloway was about to drown in it. Inside the mayor's office, Richard Calloway sat behind his grand oak desk, his face red with rage. The television screen on the wall replayed Marcus's press conference in an endless loop, each word tightening the noose around his neck. His phone buzzed for the 100th time that day, and he snatched it up. "What the hell is happening?" he barked into the receiver. On the other end, his campaign advisor sounded nervous. "Sir, we didn't see this coming. Carter played his hand faster than we expected. The media is turning against us, and some of our donors are..." "Are what?" Calloway demanded, pulling out. The advisor admitted, They don't want to be associated with. Calloway slammed his fist onto the desk. You listen to me. I have survived worse than this. We control this city. I control this city. Carter is just another bureaucrat who thinks he can take me down. He's wrong. A knock at the door interrupted him. His chief of staff entered, pale and visibly shaken. Sir, she said hesitantly, the Justice Department just issued subpoenas for all financial records related to your campaign. The FBI is preparing to conduct searches at City Hall and your personal residence. For the first time, Calloway felt it. The fear, the sinking realization that this time, he might not be able to make it disappear. The streets of Granton erupted. Protests swelled in front of City Hall, in front of police stations, in the very neighborhoods Calloway had exploited. People held up signs with Angela's face, with words like justice for Angela and Calloway must go. But it wasn't just about Angela anymore. It was about every black man and woman who had been harassed, arrested, beaten, or killed under Calloway's rule. It was about the families who had lost their homes, the businesses that had been shut down, the lives that had been destroyed. Angela stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking down at the sea of people chanting her name. She had never wanted to be a symbol, but now, she had no choice. A microphone was handed to her, and she stepped forward. My name is Angela Carter, she began, her voice strong, and I will not be silent. The crowd roared, and in that moment, she knew Calloway's days were numbered. He just didn't know it yet. Richard Calloway sat alone in his office, the heavy curtains drawn, blocking out the chaos unfolding outside City Hall. The once proud walls of his political empire now felt like a prison, closing in around him. The city he had ruled with absolute control was no longer bending to his will. His phone rang again. He ignored it. The screen was flooded with missed calls from donors, allies, and lawyers, all with the same urgent message. You're losing control. The footage of his attack on Angela had spread like wildfire, and the press conference by Marcus Carter had been the final blow. The Justice Department was breathing down his neck. Protesters filled the streets in numbers he had never seen before. City Hall was practically under siege, and his police were hesitant to act. For the first time in his career, Calloway felt real fear. The door burst open without warning. His chief of staff, Denise Holloway, stormed in, her face pale and furious. We have a problem, she snapped. Calloway scoffed, rubbing his temple. We have about 100 of them. Be more specific. Denise threw a folder onto his desk. The governor just called. He's thinking about making a public statement distancing himself from you. And if he does that, others will follow. Calloway flipped open the folder. Inside were statements from city council members, many of whom had been his staunchest supporters, now suddenly issuing condemnations, calling for an investigation, even hinting at a recall election. He clenched his jaw. Cowards. Denise folded her arms. They're politicians. They go where the wind blows. And right now, the wind is carrying Marcus Carter's name. Calloway slammed the folder shut. I built this city. I own this city. Denise met his glare head-on. Not anymore. Calloway stood abruptly, sending his chair skidding back. Then I remind them why they need me. We start fighting back. We release statements. Discredit the Carters. Find dirt on them. Denise let out a humorless laugh. You think Marcus Carter has dirt? He's the damn Attorney General. If there was anything to find, don't you think someone would have used it by now? Calloway's eyes burned with fury. Then we make something up. Denise hesitated. This was the moment she realized something crucial. Calloway wasn't just desperate. He was unraveling. And when men like him unraveled, they became dangerous. By the time morning came, Calloway's worst fears were realized. The governor of the state held a press conference in front of the Capitol building, his expression grim as he addressed the growing scandal. I have reviewed the footage, and like millions of Americans, I am appalled by what I saw. There is no place for this kind of behavior in our government, in our cities, or in our society. Effective immediately, I am calling for a full and independent investigation into Mayor Calloway's actions. If he refuses to step down voluntarily, I will support any and all legal measures necessary to remove him from office. The words landed like a hammer blow. Within minutes, every major news network broadcasted the statement. It wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a crisis. Angela and Marcus watched from their living room as the announcement played on the television. Angela exhaled slowly, but she did not look relieved. "This isn't over," she murmured. Marcus nodded. "Calloway won't go down without a fight. He's backed into a corner. And that makes him unpredictable." Angela turned to him. "What's our next move?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "We keep the pressure on. We make sure there's no way for him to escape this. No backroom deals. No political lifelines. We bury him." Angela studied him carefully. "You want to destroy him, don't you?" Marcus met her gaze without flinching. "I want to make sure he never has the power to hurt anyone else again." Angela nodded. "Then let's finish this." The morning after the governor's statement, the FBI arrived at City Hall. Armed with search warrants, agents stormed through the grand marble corridors, seizing documents, computers, hard drives, anything that could serve as evidence in their rapidly escalating case. The news helicopters circled overhead as the footage played across every channel. The mayor of Granton's office being raided by federal agents. Calloway watched from the television in his private residence, gripping his whiskey glass so tightly it nearly shattered. His phone rang. He ignored it. Then it rang again. With a growl of frustration, he snatched it up. "What?" His lawyer's voice was tense. "We have a serious problem." Calloway let out a sharp laugh. "No kidding. It's worse than you think," the lawyer continued. "They have testimony from former city officials. People in your administration have flipped." Calloway froze. "Who?" "Paul Hampton, for starters." The lawyer admitted. "He's already cooperating with the FBI. He gave them everything: paper trails, hidden accounts, kickback schemes. They have more than enough to indict you." The blood drained from Calloway's face. "And that's not all," the lawyer added. "The Justice Department is preparing to charge you with obstruction of justice and abuse of power." Calloway's grip tightened on the phone. "What are my options?" The lawyer hesitated. "You could try to cut a deal, resign in exchange for a reduced sentence. But if you fight this—" "I never resign," Calloway snarled. "I will not go down like this." The lawyer sighed. "Then prepare for war. Because they're coming for you." Calloway ended the call. His mind raced. He needed a plan. He needed leverage. And he had only one card left to play. Angela stepped into her office, flipping through the latest updates from the legal team. When her phone buzzed, it was an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A deep voice rasped on the other end. "Mrs. Carter, you've been quite the troublemaker, haven't you?" Angela's body went rigid. "Who is this?" A dark chuckle. "Let's just say I work for someone who isn't happy about your little crusade." Angela's heartbeat quickened. She glanced toward the security camera outside her office door, suddenly aware of how alone she was. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "What we want," the voice said, "is for you to back off. You and your husband. Drop the case. Walk away. Or else." Angela swallowed hard. "Or else what?" A pause. Then, chillingly soft. "Or else accidents start happening." The line went dead. Angela lowered the phone slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. She had expected Calloway to fight back. She had not expected this. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady. Then, without a moment's hesitation, she dialed Marcus. He answered on the first ring. "Angela?" She closed her eyes. "We have a problem." And just like that, the battle for justice had turned into something far more dangerous. Angela sat frozen at her desk. her heartbeat thudding against her ribs. The caller's voice still echoed in her mind, low, deliberate, and dripping with menace. Whoever they were, they wanted her and Marcus to back down, and they weren't above making threats to ensure it. She forced herself to move, standing slowly, her mind already racing through possibilities. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a warning. And if there was one thing she had learned in her years of activism, it was that threats like these weren't made idly. She grabbed her bag and left the office immediately, her fingers shaking as she dialed Marcus's number. He answered on the first ring. "Angela? We need to talk," she said, hurrying down the hallway toward the exit. "I just got a call. Someone's threatening us." There was a short pause on the other end. Then, his voice tight, controlled, but simmering with barely restrained fury. "Where are you?" "Leaving work," she said. "I didn't want to stay there. I'm coming to get you." Angela didn't argue. 20 minutes later, Marcus pulled up in his black sedan outside her office building. The moment she slid into the passenger seat, he reached over, covering her hand with his. "Tell me everything," he said. She relayed the entire conversation, the voice, the warning, the chilling final words. Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened with each detail. "They're scared," he said finally, his voice laced with steel. "They know they're losing, and this is the only move they have left." Angela swallowed. "You don't think it's just Calloway, do you?" Marcus exhaled sharply. "No, Calloway is arrogant, but he's not smart enough to orchestrate something like this. He has powerful friends, donors, backers, people who have made a lot of money off his corruption. They have everything to lose if he falls." Angela stared out the window, watching the city blur past. "So what do we do?" Marcus's jaw clenched. "We do what we were already doing. But now, we add security. You're not going anywhere alone. And neither am I." Angela turned to him. "You think they'd actually come after us?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, but the way his fingers flexed against the steering wheel told her everything she needed to know. "Yes," he said finally. "I think they would." And that realization settled over them like a storm cloud. They weren't just fighting a corrupt politician anymore. They were fighting a system determined to protect itself. And it would stop at nothing to survive. The night was restless. Angela lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Marcus paced the room, his phone buzzing every few minutes. He had called in every favor, activated every security protocol, and contacted law enforcement officials he trusted. But there was no comfort in any of it, because men like Richard Calloway didn't fight fair. At 2 a.m., Marcus's phone rang again. He snatched it up instantly. "Yeah." The voice on the other end was low and urgent. "It's David. We have a problem." Marcus went still. "What happened?" "There was a break-in at the DOJ's office in Granton. Someone tried to access the files on Calloway's case. They didn't get far, but the message was clear." Angela sat up at that. "What message?" David hesitated. "They left something behind. A single envelope on one of the desks. No fingerprints. No cameras caught them coming in or out." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "What was in the envelope?" Silence. Then, a picture of Angela. Angela sucked in a breath. Marcus's free hand curled into a fist. "I want every single resource on this. I don't care what it takes. Find out who's behind it." "Already on it," David said. "But Marcus, be careful." The call ended, and for a long moment, neither Marcus nor Angela spoke. Then Marcus turned to her, his expression dark. "They just made their biggest mistake." Angela looked at him. "What do you mean?" Marcus's voice was quiet, deadly. "They think this will scare us into backing down," he said. "But all they've done is sign their own death warrant." Angela reached for his hand, her grip firm. "Then let's finish this." And in that moment, they both knew there was no turning back. The next day, security was doubled around Marcus and Angela. Their home was being monitored. Their offices were locked down. and their schedules were altered to avoid patterns. But they knew that no amount of security could erase the real danger. Calloway, meanwhile, was unraveling under the pressure. His allies were distancing themselves. His lawyers were scrambling. And the Justice Department had issued a formal indictment against him. The charges were extensive: corruption, obstruction of justice, abuse of power. But Calloway was not going down quietly. By evening, a statement from his office was broadcast across all major news channels. He stood behind a podium, his expression severe, his voice laced with manufactured outrage. "This is nothing more than a political witch hunt orchestrated by Marcus Carter," he declared. "The so-called Attorney General is abusing his power to settle personal scores. This is an attack on democracy, an attack on the people of Granton. And I will not stand for it." Angela watched from home, shaking her head. "He's trying to rally his supporters." Marcus crossed his arms. "Let him. He's already lost. The evidence is overwhelming. And his own people are turning against him." But they both knew the real danger wasn't in Calloway's words. It was in what he would do next. It happened at night. Angela and Marcus were just finishing dinner when their security detail rushed inside. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp eyes, spoke in clipped tones. "We have an emergency." Marcus stood instantly. "What is it?" "There was an attempted arson at your office." Angela's breath caught. "What?" "The fire was set at the back entrance. It was put out before it spread. But this wasn't random. This was a warning." Marcus exhaled sharply. "They're getting desperate." Angela's hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists. "We need to end this. Now." Marcus met her gaze, nodding. "We will." The next morning, the final move was made. The Justice Department issued an arrest warrant for Richard Calloway. And this time, there would be no escape, because the storm had finally caught up to him, and it was about to bring him down. The morning was thick with tension. The city of Granton, still reeling from the protests and the political scandal that had engulfed it, now held its breath for what came next. Marcus and Angela sat in their living room, watching the live news feed. Reporters stood outside City Hall, their voices urgent as they narrated the moment the entire country had been waiting for. "Breaking news out of Granton," the anchor announced. "The Justice Department has officially issued an arrest warrant for Mayor Richard Calloway. Federal agents have been spotted entering his private residence, where he is reportedly refusing to cooperate." Angela exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. Marcus reached over, covering her hand with his. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. They both knew what this meant. After weeks of fighting, of threats, of pushing through fear, Calloway was finally about to face justice. On the screen, the camera panned to City Hall's grand entrance, where a line of black SUVs had pulled up. The moment felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Law enforcement officials in dark suits exited their vehicles with purpose, their expressions unreadable. And then there he was, Richard Calloway, stepping out of his office. His once proud posture now weighted with inevitability. His face was rigid with barely controlled rage. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. Reporters swarmed forward, microphones thrust out, shouting questions. "Mayor Calloway, do you have a response to the allegations? Are you going to resign? Do you believe this is politically motivated?" But Calloway didn't answer. Two federal agents flanked him, speaking quietly as they guided him toward one of the SUVs. His hands were behind his back, not cuffed, not yet, but restrained in a way that made it clear this wasn't voluntary. Angela leaned forward, her heart pounding as the camera zoomed in on his expression. This was a man who had spent his life untouchable, a man who had built an empire on corruption, intimidation, and fear. And now, he was just another politician caught in his own web of lies. As the SUV doors shut, sealing him inside, the reporters continued shouting. But one question, yelled above the rest, cut through the noise. "Mayor Calloway, do Do you regret putting your hands on Angela Carter? For the first time, Calloway's eyes flickered with something. Recognition, realization, defeat, and then he was gone. The SUV pulled away, taking him toward the federal courthouse, where his reckoning awaited. Angela exhaled, her body finally releasing the tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. Marcus turned to her, his gaze steady. "It's over." Angela met his eyes. "No," she said softly. "It's just beginning." The trial of Richard Calloway became the most publicized legal battle in decades. Every network covered it. Every headline dissected it. And every person in the country seemed to have an opinion. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and political figures, all waiting to see whether justice would finally be served. Angela sat in the front row beside Marcus, her presence undeniable. She wasn't just a victim of Calloway's cruelty. She was the face of the fight against him. The charges against him were staggering: corruption, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and abuse of power. But the most damning piece of evidence? The video. The prosecution played it on the massive courtroom screen, Angela standing in the boutique, Calloway stepping forward with calculated arrogance, grabbing her wrist, pushing her, humiliating her in front of an audience that had never expected to see a powerful white mayor physically assault a black woman in broad daylight. It wasn't just about that moment. It was about what that moment represented. Centuries of injustice, of systemic oppression, of people like Calloway believing they could act without consequence. The courtroom was silent as the video ended. And then, the prosecutor spoke. "Your Honor, this is not just about a single incident of violence. This is about a man who built his career on fear, who believed he was above the law. But today, we are here to prove that he is not." Marcus glanced at Angela. She was sitting tall, unshaken, her eyes locked on Calloway. And for the first time, Calloway didn't look smug. He looked afraid. The jury deliberated for 3 days. During that time, Granton remained in a state of restless anticipation. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, waiting for the final word. Would the system work? Or would Calloway walk free like so many before him? When the jury finally returned, the world held its breath. Angela and Marcus sat together, hands intertwined, as the judge asked the foreman to read the verdict. The courtroom was so silent that Angela could hear the rustling of paper as the foreman unfolded the document. In the matter of the United States versus Richard Calloway, on the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The foreman continued. On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendant guilty. Calloway's face paled. On the charge of conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty. A stunned silence followed. And then, the final blow. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. The room erupted. Reporters dashed out of the courtroom to break the news. Activists in the gallery embraced. And for the first time in history, a corrupt mayor who had thrived on racial injustice had been fully held accountable. Calloway sagged in his seat, his face drawn, his empire reduced to nothing. The judge's voice cut through the chaos. "Richard Calloway, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." Angela closed her eyes, letting the words settle. Justice had been served. Months later, the city of Granton felt different. The streets were no longer ruled by fear. The police department underwent a massive overhaul. Corrupt officials were removed, and city policies that had long oppressed marginalized communities were rewritten. Angela and Marcus stood together at a community event, surrounded by people who had once feared that change was impossible. But now, they saw it happening before their eyes. Angela stepped onto the small stage. Looking out at the crowd, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "When I walked into that boutique months ago," she began, "I never imagined that it would lead to this." The audience listened intently. But the truth is, this was never just about me. This was about every person who has ever been silenced. every injustice that has been ignored, every community that has been told they don't matter. Applause rippled through the crowd. This city has changed, she continued, but we still have work to do, and we will not stop, because justice is not just about punishing the guilty. It's about building a future where no one has to live in fear. The cheers that followed were deafening. Angela stepped down, and Marcus met her with a quiet smile. "You did it," he murmured. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "We did it." And with that, they turned toward the future, together,